Hey guys, so before I get into it, I kind of wanted to tell you where I got my data from this week. So we saw the Good Day Maverick tournament take place over last weekend. That was a combination of NA and EU, at least as far as I could tell from the top 8, and that was 64 players, so we're going to be looking at the top 8 of that one. Then we had the finals of the online league series. We're going to be looking only at the finals because it was a less than 64 person tournament. That only ran on the North American server. And finally, we're going to be looking at the top 8 from Twitch Rivals. I know it was only a 16 person tournament, so it seems a little weird to look at the top 8, but because it was such high profile players and the prize pool was so large that you would assume everybody is taking this as seriously as they possibly can, I think it's very important to look at the top 8. It's also worth noting that in Twitch Rivals, you were not allowed to run a mono region deck, so we did see a couple of players running things like Bannerman with Freljord for 1 copy of Fury of the North. I'm just going to be chalking those up as mono Demacia Bannerman decks for the purpose of these data points. So that's what I got all my shit from. Hey guys, Boulevard here. We finally started to see the tournament meta settle over the course of the last week between the Good Day Maverick tournament, Twitch Rivals, and a couple of smaller events. We've got a couple of decks to look at and what a standard lineup looks like. We saw some cool stuff, and we also saw... So if you watched last week's video, you'll remember that we saw half of the Bannerman decks running at least 1 copy of Unyielding Spirit. This week we've expanded our reach to Demacia as a whole, seeing 12 of the 17 decks running at least 1 copy, and we've expanded to Demacia as a whole because Karma Lux is something that has started to pick up in popularity. Now I want to note on that we are not touching on any of the Principles of Strengths decks from the Creator's Show match, as that is a completely different format, and the primary focus of this video series is to help you prepare for tournaments this upcoming weekend. Principles of Strength is next weekend, so no need to cover it. I'll go much more in depth on that next weekend. But for now, we're going to focus solely on Conquest tournaments. And in Conquest tournaments, Unyielding Spirit continues to perform across the board. Having an unkillable Lux or Garen or Fiora is very difficult for any regional composition to deal with, which I think is a reason that we've started to see Ionia make a comeback, as well as some adaptations out of Demacia decks in their own right. As previously mentioned, Purify is not a good answer to Unyielding Spirit as it is generally going down onto a champion. However, I do think you should continue to run it because, as I'll get into later, Endure Spiders has been a very popular deck on the last couple of weekends, and it is the best answer to they who endure. But I think Detain is a great adaptation that we're going to continue to see out of Demacia decks, Lux, Karma, and Bannerman alike, as it is one of the best answers for Unyielding Spirit, but it also synergizes with it very well. You know, if you can get an Unyielding Spirit down onto, say, your Garen, and then detain things under your Garen, those things are just gone forever. You have a 5-mana removal spell, and I do mean remove because the last breaths aren't going to trigger because the unit hasn't died. So I think Detain is something that you really need to look out for and at least heavily consider putting into your Demacia deck, and it's not wise to go all in on the Unyielding Spirit plan, as it is something that people are starting to become aware of and will continue to put answers for where they can find them, including something like Detain, because there are no other good answers in the Demacia region. I do think we're going to continue to see mono Demacia specifically because Detain comes out as an answer for the Unyielding Spirit. If you're not running Endure Spiders, you're probably not running Freljord. That's the trend that we've seen emerge over the first 2 weeks of the format, as Freljord was the least played region this weekend, and we've seen a pretty even split among the 2 versions of the Endure Spiders that we do see. This one is from Christmas Time, who top-8'd the Maverick tournament, and continues by a slim margin to be the more popular of the 2 versions. While both run Endure and Atrocity, here we see Tryndamere coming out as a high-roll Thresh target as well as a secondary finisher and good target for Atrocity, and we also see Brood Awakening. This card really helps the deck stall out against mid-range decks like Bannerman and have a smooth transition into the Endure turns, but it's also a card that is very easily answered by Bilgewater decks, which we are seeing more and more in people's lineups as they figure out the region's identity. While you're still trading a card for a card most of the time and feeding into your Endure, it's a very mana inefficient spell if it does get cleaned up by something like a Make It Rain, a Twisted Fate, a Misfortune, or even a Static Shock. On the flip side, it does have the capability to take over the early game by pushing through massive damage with Skitterer and is the easiest enabler for your Elise evolution. And this is the other version. As you can see, it's very unit heavy and the champion lineup shifts to Callista and Thresh. Without Brood Awakening, your Elise evolution is a little more inconsistent and you're playing more on curve, which makes it difficult to fit in a 5-mana spell. Callista synergizes well with the deck since you do want your units to be dying, but is also just a very aggressive 4-attack 3-mana unit with Fearsome. This version is much better at preying on decks with a weak early game and has a more consistent way to win outside of Endure. Personally, this is the version that I prefer, and I like things like Cursed Keeper coming out to make board wipes less enticing. Undying is not unheard of in this deck, as we do see Ethereal Remitter being played here. I went over this list a lot last week since it was the first time that we saw it, but I do want to point out that it is picking up popularity among Endure Spider players, which is mainly a consideration if you are running a deck with a weak early game like Karma Ezreal or Vi Heimerdinger. Since this is going to prey on your early game a little bit more, it's not as lax as the other version. A simple adaptation for something like this could be as simple as more copies of Gotcha to deal with Kalista and Wraithcaller, but ultimately the decision on how you want to handle this is up to you. And finally, I wanted to quickly touch on this version from Zeramis, who also got top 8 of the Maverick tournament. As you can see, the champions are Hecarim Maokai, which I don't hate, honestly. Hecarim is a great champion for wearing down life totals and feeding into the Endure with Spectral Riders, and Maokai does a great job of controlling the board as well as supplying a backup win condition. Generally, if an Endure gets tossed, it's not actually that big a deal, since that does mean it was at the bottom of your deck and you were unlikely to get to it anyway, but I mainly wanted to highlight the plethora of avenues that you can build around and still find a win with the Endure Spiders deck. Because the combo of Atrocity and Endure is so universal and straightforward to get to, it's kind of up to you how you want to wind the path that gets there. I also wanted to highlight Neverglade Collector in this deck. It's something that Endure Spiders have been experimenting with more and more. Some people think it's win more, some people think it's necessary to beat burn, and I do like it in a more ephemeral style deck like this. So if you do want to run Endure Spiders this weekend, look through these deck lists and pick and choose what you want to run and what you don't, and just kind of cobble it together yourself. As long as you have an Endure and Atrocity in there, you really can't go that wrong. So Twisted Fate Swain is a deck that I personally have a lot of experience on, and it's a deck that I think has been flying under the radar heading into this weekend, having a very low play rate, but a very high performance rate. For example, we only saw 2 copies of the deck over the week, but they did win Twitch Rivals and the Maverick event, and I think there's a couple of reasons that this deck is so good for tournaments. Number 1 is that the deck is made up of otherwise underused regions. Noxus has seen a large dip in playability outside of burn decks and is commonly the region to get left out of a lineup alongside Freljord, and I'll get more into that near the end when I break down what a standard lineup looks like going into this weekend. Number 2 is barrels. Barrels are a very strong mechanic for a tournament environment and work great when boosting already good removal, which Noxus provides at a more cost-effective rate than Shadow Isle. Barrels are very good against the unit-heavy decks like Bannerman and certain versions of Endure Spiders that we've seen, since they have to challenge the barrel and then you can respond with the spell. Noxian Fervor is also a phenomenal tool for dealing with turn 3 Badger Bears when boosted by a barrel, and that also gives you 2/3 of your Swain evolution in one spell. I think it's phenomenal. 3, it has a good Karina matchup. The gist is that your little guys generate immediate +1, so using removal spells on them feels bad. Swain and Leviathan are resilient to pretty much everything except Thermo Beam, and the tempo just works out in your favor. I'd highly recommend catching the finals of Twitch Rivals where we have Swim versus Dog playing out this exact matchup to see how that works out. Number 4, Ravenous Flock is broken. I think this is the weekend where the deck stops getting slept on, especially since Dog did use it to win Twitch Rivals, so take the deck into consideration when building out your lineup this weekend as well as what you think your opponents are going to be running. While there isn't a deck that seems to have a great matchup against it, for me this would be the tipping point that puts me on Endure Spiders instead of Karina, since I do think it will be a very popular deck and does have to string together multiple cards in order to answer Endure and doesn't have a clean answer to Atrocity. Sea Monsters made a bit of a resurgence at Twitch Rivals specifically, and I don't have a great answer as to why that happened other than the deck is solid and the builds are more refined than week 1. We're also seeing less Ruination come out of players. Shadow Isle's entire identity lately has felt like an Atrocity combo region between Endure Spiders, Karina, and Sea Monsters. Now, I know that seems like a weird thing to say since we don't see Atrocity in this specific deck from POC, and it's not in an overwhelming amount of Karina decks, but we did see versions of all 3 running it last weekend. It's very similar to Unyielding Spirit in that it requires very specific answers depending on what it is being used with, but it ends the game much more immediately than Unyielding Spirit. And if you were hoping for advice on how to beat out Atrocity combo decks, you've come to the wrong place since all 3 play so differently, and that's the power of the combo. I'm here to give you advice based on numbers, and the best I can do is let you know that Endure Spiders will almost certainly be the most popular Shadow Isle deck this weekend, followed by Karina, followed by Sea Monsters. Now, if you're tired of running Bannerman and want to play Lux instead, those are pretty much your only Demacia options, it feels like. Bannerman or Lux. MF Scouts is essentially a Bannerman deck, but my point is that Karma Lux and Vilux are 2 decks that we've seen pop up over the course of the last weekend. This Vilux is from Evangelion, getting top 8 at Twitch Rivals, so I definitely think there is room to experiment and play around with the archetype, and while you should play what you're comfortable with, especially going into a tournament, if you are sick of Bannerman but know that you need to run Demacia because it is such a powerful region, you have options. Alright, so now I want to get into what a standard lineup would look like. I'm still figuring out the process on the best way to show this, and there's a lot of variables to consider, and I'm going to show you pretty much every combination that you could run. So honestly, leave a comment, let me know if this was too hard to follow, and I'll try to figure out the process a little bit more smoothly in the future. So I think your standard lineup is going to be taking a look at these 4 decks on the left and picking 3 of them for your lineup. You have Mono Demacia Bannerman, Endure Spiders, Twisted Fate Swain, and then the Ionia PZ combination can either be Karma Ezreal or Vi Heimerdinger. Personally, I'm a bigger fan of Vi Heimerdinger. And of course, if you do go for the first 3 decks, Mono Demacia Bannerman, Endure Spiders, and TF Swain, then you can move your Ionia into the Demacia and play Karma Lux if you so choose. And I do think that is going to be the standard that most people play, is picking 3 of those 4 decks. This middle column is used to represent sort of, I guess you could say, the second most standard lineup of picking decks from. So you have Mono Demacia Bannerman, which you're going to see across the board. It's just such a flexible option for your lineup, leaves you so many other options. Karina Veraza, and then every time we saw Karina played last weekend, it was paired with either Twisted Fate Swain or Twisted Fate Lee Sin. Twisted Fate Lee Sin is a deck that I'm personally still not super sold on. If I was going for Karina, I would play the Twisted Fate Swain. And as previously mentioned, if you do leave your Ionia open, you do have the option to slot your Demacia into Karma Lux. But I do think that Bannerman, Karina, TF Swain is going to be a pretty powerful lineup going into this weekend. Not as popular as the one on the left, but still probably the second most popular lineup to watch out for. So this column on the right is mostly here to remind you that burn exists, much like the Ionia into Demacia flex that you can do. If you find yourself with PZ Noxus open, you can play burn. It's definitely fallen off over the last week. There were no burn decks in the top 8 of Twitch Rivals. There were only 3 burn decks across the top 8 of the Maverick and the finals of the OLS. This deck is certainly past its prime a little bit as people have sort of adapted their strategies to deal with it. I do think you'll still see it in the top 8 of Duels of Runeterra 9, but it's definitely not going to be as popular across the board, and you can kind of take a deep breath and not prepare for this deck as hard, I believe. Of course, if you run Sea Monsters, Heimer Vi or Karma Ezreal is also still on the table to go with your Mono Demacia. I do think that's still a solid lineup, and the point of this graph is sort of sure, that's what this is. The point of this series of pictures and lineups is to let you know exactly how flexible the field currently is. There's a lot of decks that you can run, and while Mono Demacia will pretty much be a standard across all of them, we do see Karma Lux popping up. It's not even unreasonable to cut Demacia out of your lineup. We did see Brian Kibler top 8 Twitch Rivals without playing any Demacia in true Kibler fashion. If you look at the lineup on the left, you have 3 very solid decks that don't include Demacia in any capacity, and I do think you have to run Endure Spiders if you're not running Demacia. That much I will say. So if you do want to cut Demacia, that's fine. Please play Endure Spiders. Just some final thoughts before I wrap up the video here. Number 1, Atrocity and Unyielding Spirit, as previously mentioned, are running the tournament scene. Please be prepared for those cards when you are going in this weekend. Number 2, next week's video, while I want to focus on Principles of Strength, it's kind of hard. There's not a lot of actual data for the format. We had the Creators Showcase, but because it was only 8 players in the tournament for Europe and North America, as far as I know, there was no prize pool, which means the players weren't super incentivized to take it seriously. So there's a little bit that the data shows, and I can tell you what I can, but other than that, don't expect like a fully in-depth half an hour, here's how to build a side deck and here's how to win Principles of Strength, because the data just isn't there to support it. Other than that, yeah, thank you guys for watching so much, and I'll be back next week with another Tournament Tactician trying to help you win in your Conquest style formats especially, and the online league series will be back as they are firing on Duels of Runeterra's off weeks. Good luck in Duels of Runeterra, guys, or any other tournament that you choose to participate in this weekend. I'll see you next week.